Why do we play video games? It's a loaded question with answers that change on an inherently personal level. So too then is the question, why do we make video games? Infinite answers. We joke all the time about the homogeneity of the industry at the moment. Yet another extraction game, a 5v5 hero shooter to add to the growing pile of 5v5 hero shooters. And that's before we even start discussing battle passes, forever games, and carefully crafted FOMO. I think it's important to remember unique experiences are still being made. It's just harder for them to break through the noise and get noticed. It can happen, it's not impossible. Animal Well is a game that deserves every success it gets. Balatro broke 1 million sales. But those are fringe cases. Exceptions, not expected. Why do we play video games? Why do we make video games? Infinite answers, infinite reasons. Escapism, larger-than-life stories, fictional characters, personal moments, personal stories. To cope? To hide? To reflect? To process? Upcoming indie title The End of You is a game that definitely isn't for everyone. An hour-long vertical slice of a relationship that captures the uncertainty, loss, and reflection that comes when a relationship has run its course. The End of You is bleak, heavy, and unyielding in its approach. You play as Walter, a man who, after having broken up with his long-term partner, goes through the traumatic and cathartic experience of boxing up his memories of the relationship to try and process, understand, cope, and maybe move on. The End of You covers topics of infertility, endometriosis, depression, and most importantly, mental health, which is a lot to take in such a short amount of time. I was lucky enough to sit down with the creator Coyan Cardenas to discuss some of the themes of the game and how a game like this manifests itself into the world.
So basically, I was, in terms of how the project came to be, after the last project, The Stillness of the Wind, I basically was completely burnt out. And I went through a period of 3 years of just not being able to work at all. Like I'm working on prototypes and things, and I released a few small games, I think, just free ones, but I couldn't work on a real project essentially. And so after that 3 years, I got the ADHD diagnosis, which kind of, turned my world upside down, but in a good way.
Yes,
My world
it
was
gives you
upside down before.
answers, yeah.
Exactly, like a lot of answers that I was looking for, and so things started to make a lot of sense. And so, with medication and all the things, I started to kind of come out of that. And kind of towards the end of the 5 years, Unity did that that now infamous install fee announcement.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, that's it for Unity. So I've been wanting to try and Godot the engine for a while, because I've heard lots of great things about it. So I was like, I'll just try Godot, see what it's like. And so obviously when you're playing with a new engine, the best thing to do is just try and make a little game. So I actually I followed this very basic, like Babby's first game kind of tutorial. It was like a make your first horror game kind of thing. So I was just following that, kind of learning the engine. And then I was like, well, okay, well, I kind of get into grips with the engine, so I'll make an environment. And actually, I've always wanted to make a game set within a one-bedroom apartment. Purely because, you mentioned earlier, like a lot of my process is seeing what mainstream games are doing and then do the complete opposite. Obviously, open world games are a big thing. Yeah. And you play a AAA game, and the environment art is amazing. Like, so much detail, so much work and hours put into that. But it's essentially a corridor. You run through. There's no interaction. You're just running through it. And sometimes I'll play a game, or I'll watch someone playing a game, and I'm just in awe of how much work has gone into this environment, but it's just window dressing, you know. And players quickly learn to stop seeing that because they're looking for, you know, the treasure chest or the, you know, the enemies, but so they're not looking at the environment. And I think that's a massive shame. So the idea was a one-bedroom flat, a game contained within that. The player could actually learn and grow to understand that space and feel like they have an intimate connection with that space, and they can really embody it, as opposed to just flying through content. You know, worlds, like literally planets, just jumping from planet to planet, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, seen this next, you know. But keeping them in a one-bedroom flat, like, it's just it's kind of the idea was like how much, you know, how can I keep the player interested within a tiny space, and how can I have the player kind of form an intimate connections, and by the end of the game feel like they actually know that space. You know, they know every corridor, they know every room, they know every inch of that space. So I started making like this one-bedroom flat. So I was like,
Okay.
you know, I just want to make a small game, and I didn't have a story in mind or anything. I started coming up with a few ideas, but nothing concrete. And then I broke up with my partner in real life, and it just made sense at that point. You know, instead of going into work and trying to forget all that and just make a game that's completely separate, it just made sense to, you know, relationships and breakups were on my mind. So it made sense, you know, to come into work, and when I'm working on this game, which I was looking for a narrative anyways, to just put all that into the game.
The Interview isn't a joyous game. It's somber isolationism. Walter is alone in his small one-bedroom flat with nowhere to go, processing his grief in a meaningful way to him, by putting the items of the relationship into a box. Coyan mentioned during the interview that originally he had played with the idea of the character being nameless and the text being from your perspective before changing it. And it was definitely a needed change, as you can at times find yourself hating Walter as a character because of the choices you're presented with, which was incredibly interesting, as those choices could be ignored. You don't have to pick them, but they're there. Intrusive thoughts permeating the conversation, poisoning the situation, as depression and poor mental health is wont to do. Something like this, like you mentioned mental health, and like mental health is incredibly important, and I think it's something that it's only recently that we've actually started to pay as much attention to it as we should have as a society. But there's also situations where, even though it's now less of a stigma to talk about it and to actually discuss it, it's still a problem for some people, because something that I see from friends a lot is they're like, oh, I don't want to be a burden, because you have your own problems that you're dealing with, and I don't want to give you my problems on top of that. And so there's that kind of aspect to it where you then just kind of fester in your own like depression and self-hatred, because like Walter isn't a good character. I mean, like, he makes some bad statements and bad choices, and like you can play it and you can hate that character, but if you actually take a step back and assess the game, then it's a case of, no, I'm pretty sure that Walter hates Walter too. Like, and you can see it in some of the things that are said, because something that I at first thought it was a bug, but then realized it wasn't, is that Walter's quite an unreliable narrator, in that like, you can make choices and Walter won't say the thing that you actually clicked. Like, there's several conversations where you can just be like, yes, let's talk, and Walter will be like, no, I don't want to talk about it. Or you can be like, no, I'm fine, and Walter will just be like, yeah. Or like, there was one key moment for me where your partner asks you a very heavy question, and there's two very straightforward yes no answers, and then there's a third very very different answer, and you can't click it. Like if you try, Walter's response is just that standard like, no, I'm okay. Like he he never lets you in, or he never lets his partner in. Like
Yeah.
it's
And that's kind of the first line in dialogue, isn't it? It's in the first conversation where the partner is saying that, please let me in.
yeah.
And I think it is like you say, like it's from the perspective of Walter who can't say what he feels.
Yeah.
So when you have these options, and the player might choose something, but I know I've personally experienced this. I'm sure you have as well, and many people do. But when you're speaking to somebody, especially if it's a relationship, sometimes you can't say the thing that you're thinking.
No, sometimes you have this voice screaming in your head to say something, and you still are just like, no.
You get scared and you get cold feet, or even you don't want to hurt the other person, because there are some options where I think Walter doesn't want to share because he's scared, and there's other times when he can't say what he feels because he thinks it's going to hurt the other person and he doesn't want to. But I think those moments are quite human, in that, especially in a relationship, you feel something, but you can't tell the other person how you feel because it's going to hurt them and you don't want to hurt them. And I think a lot of people can relate to relationships that have gone on far too long because you haven't had the courage to actually be honest and say, actually, you know what? It's not doing it for me, and because nobody likes the breakup. Nobody wants to do that. Unless you're, you have very serious problems. Nobody goes into a relationship wanting to hurt the other person.
Yeah.
Everyone goes into it optimistic.
It was incredibly unsettling and uncomfortable to see this amount of personal exposure of someone else's thoughts. It was akin to some sort of perverse voyeurism, seeing the private sections of a life not yours. This game, the end of you really feels, from my point of view, is like a little bit like perverse voyeurism. Like I'm seeing something I shouldn't be seeing, because it feels it feels like such an intimate part of someone else's relationship that there's an uncomfortableness to actually being part of it. Like when two people are having an argument in a coffee shop next to you, you kind of feel that like pull away of not wanting to be here. And so like the end of you had like just buckets of that. Was that intended?
Like discomfort is probably the primary emotion that I'm trying to evoke.
Well, you succeeded. You definitely succeeded.
Good.
And mental health is a clear thread throughout the game. Walter not only has aspects of being an unreliable narrator, because the game is based on memories, but at times the choices you choose are outright ignored, an aspect that felt incredibly realistic. The knowledge of what you should say, or what you want to say in a moment, being overrun by the voices in your head forcing you to take an alternate path. Walter isn't a hero in the story. He's a flawed individual going through a traumatic experience. We're passengers along for the ride. That inner demon potentially occasionally making bad decisions manifest. Options appearing on the screen that you'd never say in an actual conversation. But the temptation is there. We could click those. The question arises, in this moment, are we Walter's mental illness? I feel like there are times when I judged Walter very negatively on the things that he was thinking, based on those options of what I could say, not what I did say. And yet those are the intrusive thoughts that all of us have at some point, at some time. Like how many times have you had the call of the void and thought about throwing yourself over a balcony? Or how many times have you thought about, well, what would happen if I did this, or if I said that? And so it's interesting to me that you managed to put the player in a situation where even through inaction, you can elicit a incredibly strong emotional response.
Yeah, and I think that's where the honesty comes in, right? Because I think it's that kind of stuff which it has to be experienced firsthand in order to create that. Because if you're going about it in a traditional way and you're coming up with dialogue choices, it would be more based on what the player wants to do or blah blah blah. But yeah, like this like very intimate, you're getting an insight into his intent and his thought patterns, and this critical voice that keeps interjecting, almost like interrupting the memory and saying, and being self-critical or whatever. Those kinds of things that are always there with us.
There's a non-linearity to the process as well, which is indicative of not only real life, but also ADHD. The memories are attached to items around Walter's flat, but the order in which you can interact with them is free for the player to discover. If you've ever been through a traumatic experience, you'll know that you can't control what items will trigger which memories. Jan also wanted this to be part of the game, to reflect how his brain works and how ADHD can affect thought processes. Disconnected jumps being made from one thought to another. You start by looking at a video cassette and end in a conversation about what to have for dinner. Is there a reason for it being kind of non-linear in the choices you make?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, I think it all goes back to me being ADHD, essentially.
Okay.
And kind of thinking about, because, after my ADHD diagnosis, I would look back on my relationships and realize they weren't just me in a relationship. It was me in a relationship with undiagnosed ADHD, right? And so with ADHD, one of the main things is you just have like a million things going on in your head, and thoughts are just like coming and going, and you're just like jumping between one thing and the next and the next and the next. So I didn't want to have this like linear story that is just told to the player, like, this is what happened. It was all going good, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then it was over. The idea is Walter in his head, he's just spinning and just going over and jumping from like one to the next, and you have no idea what the time frame is of this thing. You have no idea how long the relationship was, or the time difference between each of the memories, or the chronological order. They're all just, and I think the point is, like, I wasn't trying to tell a story of this is what happened. It was just these events, some of them more meaningful than others. But I think when you go through a breakup or any kind of big kind of life event like that, you go through and you think about all these different moments, some of them that you've maybe forgotten about, but you remember in hindsight, and you kind of reevaluate them and you see them differently now that it's over. But you're not going from A to B and putting it in a chronological order. Your brain is just like grabbing random thoughts that are seemingly kind of completely unrelated. But
it's more authentic in a way, it feels like, when it comes to how breakups can affect you, because you don't process a breakup in linear fashion.
No, exactly.
You don't know what item is going to trigger memories or trauma, and you don't know when you're going to, see uh, the false outline of your ex in a crowd, or when you're
Exactly,
going to
yeah.
pass that dark room. So
And there's actually like most of the items that you find have a quite obvious connection to the memory that it triggers.
yeah,
But there's one, and I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's one that is completely, it doesn't connect at all. And the reason for that is it did initially, but then when I edited the text, I actually removed it because I didn't think it needed it. And then I realized that the item and the conversation are completely divorced. And I was like, oh, well, I need to connect that. Then I thought, wait, do I though? Because that is, and I'm not sure if this is how neurotypical brain works, but this is how my brain works. I'll see something, and then my brain will think about it, and then it'll jump
yeah,
from one thing to one thing, and then I'll arrive on a final idea that is completely different to the object. And if I'm talking, a lot of times I can say something, and then they'll say, well, how is that related? But they haven't seen the jump that I've made in my head to get to that point.
there is no respite here. No happy memories, no joy to be found. If you're looking for it, don't. Because in this moment, Walter has none. The relationship must have had them for it to last so long. That's not the focus. There are no bright moments, and that's what makes this such a unique experience. The desire must be there to sprinkle them in, to give the player and Walter hope, but it would feel disingenuous. Depression is an unrelenting beast, and it's a brutally honest showing that Coyan was willing to tell the story to this level, to allow people to see how critical someone can be, to be this open with a public audience.
As a creator, obviously I could present myself as this angel who's just always making the best decisions and all these things. I think one part of it is being vulnerable and accepting that we all make mistakes, and especially in relationships, we can say the wrong thing, we can do the wrong thing, but there's another side of it, which is the mental health side, in that we can also be very, very critical of ourselves.
Yeah.
And the game is taking place kind of after the breakup. So the breakup's already happened. And he's going through and he's trying to gain some meaning and closure. But he obviously is not in the best of state in terms of his mental health. And I know in the past, for me, I have been very, very harsh on myself and very critical, and have been prone to catastrophizing and thinking the worst in every situation and focusing on the negative things and kind of just spiraling, and not being able to see the positive, and that was another conscious decision, that there, obviously when you're going through a breakup, a relationship, a meaningful relationship, is going to have good things and bad things, right?
Yeah.
But Walter is focused on the bad things. He's focused on these bad things that probably maybe led to the breakup, maybe didn't. But he's focusing on the negative. He's focusing on the negative, and he's putting himself down, and he's blaming himself, and he's saying I did the wrong thing, and blah blah blah. And that is indicative of someone with very poor mental health. So my intention of doing it from the perspective of Walter, no other outside perspective. You don't get an objective view of what happened.
Yeah.
He could be just, being hard on himself, and kind of seeing blaming himself and putting all this negative spin on things which actually didn't exist at the time, you know, or exaggerating certain things, or you know, because these things are memories from his point of view. You as a player don't know that it's completely accurate to what happened. You know, memory has a way of morphing over time and changing, and you know, so the idea is that it's all very negative and he's very negative, but that's because his mental health is not in the best of places, you know. But it's definitely like where I've been in the past as well. I've just always just never been able to, you know, love myself and give myself the time and self-care and all of that stuff. Like, just not being able to do that, and always kind of catastrophizing and focus on the negative and things like that.
It was interesting to me that Walter is also stuck on this path. At one point, I tried to see what would happen if I just outright rejected the premise of this game. If I objected to the idea of everything having to go in the box. What if that cup Emily made meant something to me, to Walter? What if he wanted to keep it? Sitting there, staring at the cup on the table, all you can do is wait, knowing that eventually it has to go in the box. Because in this situation, that's the right thing to do. The items, the box, the process. It has to happen. There is no saving the relationship. That moment has passed. This story doesn't involve a hero, a princess, or a castle. It involves a flawed individual, a ghost of love, and a one-bedroom flat. I tried to see what would happen if I didn't put items in the box. What happens if I want to like hold the mug that she's made, or what happens if I want to keep the tape that I made? And the game wouldn't let me. And it's like, that's obviously intentional, but how did you come about that kind of choice of finality in that, no, these items must go in the box?
I think it goes back to what you were saying right at the beginning, when you were saying that it's uncomfortable because you're in Walter's shoes. And so I wanted, you know, it's like if I wanted to make it like a video game, I would have it so that actually you can save the relationship, you know. Like, you know,
and that you would get an achievement for each item you did or didn't put in the box, exactly, and so on. Yeah. Okay.
So you could, you know, or there's a secret option somewhere where you could actually save the relationship and you get a happy ending. And I was like, no, this is a set story from Walter's point of view, and this is how it happened to him. And so, in a way, I wanted to remove any kind of it's the same reason why I gave him a name, right? Because there was a question early on. It's like, do I just have it as you know, as in the text, it says you say this, you say that,
yeah,
or does it say Walter said that? And it was an intentional decision to say, no, it's not you talking.
Yeah,
it's Walter. You're a guest. You're a voyeur in his story.
Yes, it did feel incredibly voyeuristic.
As a gamer, I think you leave some of your agency at the door.
Yeah.
And you know, so I tease you a little bit with some options, you know, so you know, and there are options you can take, but ultimately you can't change the outcome. And ultimately what is going to happen is going to happen. And as a gamer, you can't save the world, you know, you can't save the relationship. That's just how it is.
And so then I played it through again, and I was like, well, no, what happens if I interact with everything, but I don't put it in the box, and I just leave them stacked up here because I want to keep them? And then it was like, well, what happens if I only put some items in the box? And I tried to negotiate with the box. to see what would happen. And I'm sure as a developer, you're like, oh, fun interactions.
Yeah. But yeah, so at the end of the game, there's a link to a charity, mental health charity.
Yes, there is.
Because my idea was, or my hope is that it would get you thinking. If you start hating this character Walter because of the things he's thinking, and then you think, well, actually, sometimes my thoughts are not the healthiest. The idea that someone could actually start thinking about their own mental health and even seek help if they feel the need or if they feel like they should, would be amazing to me, because I definitely could have used a little gentle push earlier in my life to say, look, you're doing okay, but you could be doing a lot better, and actually I didn't realize how bad my mental health was, because you can't be in anybody else's head, right? You can't. But I guess this game is the closest you can be to being in somebody else's head. And it's the head of someone who has very bad mental health. So maybe if you start relating a little bit too much to Walter, there's a link at the end that says, help is there. And I think a lot of people, maybe men especially, are known for not seeking help, right?
I fully agree.
If they seek help, it means they're crazy or deranged or something, kind of admitting that they have a problem. But I think admitting you have a problem is the first step to actually overcoming it, right?
So sometimes it's also quite hard to see that you're in a hole when you're in the hole. It takes help and perspective to actually be like, oh, no, I'm not okay. Games as a medium aren't always meant to be joyous experiences. They're meant to make us feel something. Joy, happiness, satisfaction at a job well done, relaxation from a hard day of work, but quiet reflection, a calming sadness, catharsis are also there. The end of you most definitely falls at the bluer end of the spectrum. It doesn't so much fly as it does wallow. And it does it in such an incredibly raw and personal way that you could only find that experience in a small game like this. The End of You is out now for a price of around $8, and it's worth the hour of your time it takes, and will be one of the most unique games you play this year. A game about finality and boxes, which for one sole developer was his own finality, his own personal box.